All right, good morning everyone, and welcome to another ePrime live stream. My name is Devon Struthers, and I'll be your presenter for this morning. So today's topic is about analog in ePrime. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, analog in is sending signals from an external device using different voltages and then sending them into ePrime for processing later. So if you're still unfamiliar, you're probably asking, why is this used in ePrime? This is used if you have a custom response box, for example. If you have a response box that, is not directly able to be plugged into the computer and recognized by ePrime, this is actually a way that you can get this response box to still send signals to ePrime and still be able to interact with this response box. Another good example of this, or a great example that we have, is if you go to our product page, we actually have a slider that's available as an extension for our Chronos. It's just a little slider that you can interact with, and this actually communicates with ePrime strictly through analog in signals. So this is another really good example of how you would use analog in your experiment, just kind of to have different response paths and response options for your experiments. So as I mentioned a little earlier, the analog in is going to be accomplished through Chronos, and Chronos is our response box. You can find that on our page at pstnet.com, and I do recommend using Chronos to handle the analog in signal for a lot of really important reasons. I mean, first and foremost, it is ePrime compatible. If you go to any experiment or open any experiment, especially in ePrime 3, click on Devices and click Add. We actually have a Chronos device here. Chronos is a USB only device, and it plugs directly into the USB port of any computer, which most, if not all, computers at this point have at least one USB port that you can use for this kind of communication. So this is really a good use case for, hey, I have this really fancy, really nice response box, but it has these weird cables coming out of it, and I don't know how to hook it up to my computer or ePrime. In this case, we can use Chronos as a go-between. Chronos, like I said, is USB, but we've managed to make it millisecond accurate. So despite it being a USB-based response box, you don't have the same types of latencies that you would have whenever you plug a typical USB-based response box into the computer. There actually is another live stream on Chronos and how it gets its timing, so I do recommend checking that one out if you're more interested in how we're able to maintain that millisecond accuracy while still using a USB-based response device. But that same millisecond accuracy then carries over to whatever you would plug into Chronos, obviously, through that analog in. And then Chronos is able to have that analog in signal from the external device either straight out of the box, because there is an analog input portion of it just right on the back, but we also make an expansion kit for it. And this is going to kind of be the major hardware difference. And that's entirely depending on what type of signals you need, how complex the signals are. Is it just the push of a button or a flick of a switch, on and off Boolean? Then you can just, all you'll really need is just Chronos out of the box. Or is this a slider that's going to be sending a broad range of values? And if it's that case, then you're probably going to want to buy our I/O expander, just so you can actually send that range of signals into ePrime in the end. But as far as physically connecting these things would be concerned, what you would need is obviously your response box, or whatever is going to be sending signals into ePrime. That's going to be attached to Chronos, and Chronos is, like I mentioned before, is either going to have this connected through the analog input in the back, if you're looking for relatively non-complex types of signals, or if you're looking for more complex types of signals, then you would have the I/O expander connected to Chronos and your response box connected directly to our I/O expander. And there's actually a row in the I/O expander that just says analog input. It's really easy to see, and it's all labeled very clearly, so just plug them in there. And then all you have to do is plug your Chronos directly into your computer through USB, and you have it all set up. So the hardware portion of this is actually the easiest part of it. Just plug everything in and plug the Chronos into the computer, and you're all good. So as far as the actual Chronos handling of analog signals are concerned, I'm going to kind of walk through how Chronos handles these signals. So if you're following along at home, and if you'd like to, go ahead and add a Chronos to your experiment by double-clicking on it in the Add Input Devices page right there. Go ahead and double-click on Chronos, and if you look here, we actually have an analog in tab. So we'll click on this analog in tab. Now the first thing that you should notice here is we have a lot of analog in channels at the top. The first thing that you'll note, or the first one that's highlighted, is analog in 1. You'll notice we have 5 analog in channels, but you can only actually send data to channels 1, 2, and 3. Analog in 4 is actually specific to our photosensor, and you can't send signals through this one. And analog in 5 is our aggregate channel. So if I'm sending signals through analog 1, 2, and 3, analog in 5 actually takes all of those channels and kind of meshes them all together, and then it'll give you an output file that tells you all of the analog signals coming in from all of the channels at all, during any point in time. So it's actually a really helpful channel, but you can't actually use that one. You can only use channels 1, 2, and 3. Now, an important distinction I want to make between analog in 1, analog in 2, and analog in 3 is that analog in 1 actually has a protection diode on it. Now, it's really important if you're not entirely sure what kinds of signals your device is sending. So this actually will stop any signal that comes in before it becomes damaging to Chronos. The end result of that, though, is that any signal sent in through analog in 1 ends up having a little more noise than it would with analog 2 or analog 3. So what I do recommend is if you're testing out your device for the very first time, send the signal strictly through analog in 1. That way you know that you're not going to accidentally fry the device if you accidentally send too many voltages, because it has that protection diode in it. And frying the device, of course, voids the warranty if you send in too much electricity into Chronos, obviously. But analog in 1 has that protection diode, so it's good to just test out. Just try it out first, see what kinds of signals you're getting, see where the min and the max are, and then we can scale that later. Analog 2 and analog in 3, like I said, are going to have much less noise, but they don't have that protection diode on there. So once you've used analog in 1 to really figure out, these are the kinds of signals I'm getting, this is my min range, this is my max range, once you've set all of that in analog in 1, then I recommend going over to analog in 2 and analog in 3 just so you can get signals without as much noise. The next property we have here is our sample rate. This is just a hertz rate of samples that are coming into Chronos from your external device. That's entirely dependent on device, obviously. If you don't know or aren't sure, just try analog in 1, connect it to analog in 1, and then just try different sample rates to see what you have. As far as scaled min and scaled max are concerned, these are floating point values. You can actually put whatever value you decide into here, but by default, it is 0 and 1. So these guys are just going to offset the signals that are coming in by whatever scale you decide. Our default is just from 0 to 1. History size. History size determines how many samples from the external device you're including in this file that you're writing out that just has all of the triggers, and I'll show an example of those files later. But how many of those samples from the analog in are you going to include before EEPRIME is going to start overwriting some of the earliest ones? If you want to keep absolutely everything, which is what our default value is, then you can go ahead and just keep it here at 100,000. That way it's going to keep the first 100,000 signals that come in through your analog in and write it out to this file here. And then you have this aggregate property. So aggregate property is set to yes by default, and what this means is it determines whether or not this particular channel, so in this case analog in 1, it determines whether or not this channel is going to be kept in the analog in 5 aggregate portion of it. So for example, if I know that I'm only getting signals from analog in 1 and I want to ignore analog in 2 and 3, I would actually set aggregate to no for 2 and for 3. That way these aren't even being considered in my aggregate file, and all I have is my analog in 1 when it's output. Or let's say I have something set up to analog in 1 and analog in 3. I'll keep 2 set to no for aggregate, and then I will only look at my 1 and 3. So this just determines what gets written to that file. The next two properties we have are the onset/offset threshold. These are actually set depending on your device. This 55% to 45% is going to cover a broad range. So, typically the defaults are going to be pretty good here. But these are actually just going to change depending on what types of device or what types of signals your device is sending into Chronos. Now, the rest of these properties here, the file name, at auto definition, data column name, data column headings, and row definitions, and file encoding, these are all actually, these all have to do with the file that's being output after you collect all of the data from your analog input. So it actually creates a .txt file, in this case. It creates a .txt file that just lets you know the signals that were sent in, how they were sent in, and then it'll make an XML file for you. So it actually just, these are how you define like what the file's called. And then it lets you actually determine what types of columns you have in that data file. So in this case, I have RT time in microseconds, sample, sequence, channel, experiment that I'm using, date, time, session time. Like those are going to be the columns in this file. And then my row definition, so how am I actually feeding information into here? And then I can keep my file encoding set to Unicode or ASCII. Alright, so that's all the properties that I have here, but there's also one other place that you can look for audio in or analog in information in Chronos. And that's if you go into this responses tab here. The responses tab here, you're going to see that I have my buttons at the top, so obviously 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But then if you look along the bottom, you're going to notice analog in 1, analog in 2, analog in 3. And photosensor, but photosensor is an analog in 4 that I had mentioned earlier that we don't actually use. Analog in 1, 2, and 3, these are what we call pseudo buttons. The pseudo buttons are actually going to sort of fake a response whenever it gets a signal from that channel. So if I do analog in 1, for example, it's going to look like the Chronos pressed a 9 on its little button box, so that way I can actually use that as a response object or as an input mask for my experiment. And that's actually what we're going to start with today. We're going to start is using analog input from Chronos as an input mask, and we can use that to terminate a response. I'm actually going to try to log a press and a release on these things. So a press in this case is going to be a 9, and a release according to E prime nomenclature is going to be a -9, and that's going to be a release on the analog in 1. So it's going to be basically from setting the value from high to low. So to do that, now that we know that analog in 1 and those signals are going to be used as a 9 as my pseudo button, what I'm going to do is actually just make a very quick, very simple experiment that's just going to hold on a slide object until E prime receives a signal from analog in 1. So to do that, now that I have my Chronos all set up, I'll go ahead and apply that change. I'm going to go ahead and go into my experiment. So I'm actually just going to set up an experiment in the typical E prime way that we do. There's going to be an introduction slide, there's going to be a block list and a trial list. It's going to look a little silly now, but I am going to add a second block because we're going to make this experiment a little more complex later. So the first thing I'm going to do is add a welcome text display object. And I'm just going to rename this by hitting F2, and I'm just going to rename this introduction. There we go. Now that I'm in my introduction text display object, I'm going to go ahead and double click on it to open it in the workspace, and I'm just going to write some very simple text in here. Welcome to the experiment, press any key to continue. So now that I have my text, the only thing I have to do now is just change the duration input tab by clicking on the slide or the sub-object properties page there. Click on duration input and change duration from 1000 to infinite. Click add, and I'm just going to add a Chronos here. So they can actually press any button on the Chronos that they would like to advance from this. And I'm going to change time or data logging here to time audit only. Go ahead and click apply and OK. And now that I have that done, the next thing I'm going to do is add a block list to my experiment. The block list just controls different types of trials in your experiment. And the first type of trial that we're going to make is just going to be that pseudo button trial. So I'm going to take a list object, drag it just after my introduction here, and I'm going to rename my list object from list1 to block list. And my block list is going to contain so far one procedure, and this procedure is just going to be called block proc. I do not want to make the default value for newly created levels because I do plan on making another list later, or another procedure later. So in my block proc, I'm going to make a trial list. The trial list is where I hold most of my independent variables, or the bulk of the independent variables for these types of trials. Since this is mostly just demonstrating the analog input functionality, I'm not actually going to put much in this trial list, so it's going to look a little silly here, but this is going to help it. So if you actually are following along, you can take your experiment and just kind of scale it up. So this is where you would put all the different stimuli that you use, all the different correct responses. In our case, we are literally just going to use, just going to make 4 instances of one trial, or one procedure. So this will be our trial list. and type trial list and hit enter. My computer wants to restart. I sure hope it doesn't. Alright, so my procedure is just going to be called trial proc. And I will make the default value for newly created levels, and all I'm going to do is I'm just going to add 3 more levels, just so I have, it'll run through this 4 times. That'll be completely fine. So, as per most of my experiment designs here, the first thing I'm going to add is a fixation. The fixation is just going to be a single plus sign in the middle of the screen, and it's going to be just a way to draw participants' eyes to the center of the screen. So I'm going to take a text display object, and I'm just going to drag it and drop it into the very first part of my trial procedure here. And I'm going to rename this from text display 1 to fixation. I'm going to double click on it to open it in the workspace here. Wow. And I'm just going to add a little plus sign here. So that's going to be my fixation for the center of the screen. I'm going to change the duration of this from 1,000 to 500 milliseconds. And I'm going to change data logging from none to time audit only. Let's go ahead and click apply and OK. And that's the only change I need to make to fixation. Pretty easy. So after that is where I want to actually add my stimulus object. Now it could really be any of these input objects or any of these e-objects here, as long as they enable input. I'm just going to use a text display just to simplify things. There's no need to make things more complicated than they are right now with a slide object, so I'm just going to take a text display object, and I'm going to rename this to stimulus. So after I have my stimulus object made, I'm just going to type something very, very simple here. So, waiting for a response from my analog input. There we go. So now is where I have to add the pseudo button for my Chronos device. So I'll go ahead and click on the properties page icon there, and then under the duration input tab, I'm actually just going to set the duration to infinite, just so it stays on the slide until it gets a response from the analog input, and I'm going to add a Chronos device. Now for Chronos, I'm going to add a 9, because analog in for the first channel, so analog in 1, is a 9, and then as a release for that, I'm just going to put -9. Now right here it says value contains releases, device is not accepting releases. So that's something that I'm going to have to change on the Chronos device itself. But for now, we'll just keep this at 9, so it's just waiting for an input from the Chronos device into analog 1. I'm going to change data logging to standard. That way I actually get the timestamp and whether or not Chronos got that analog 1 input. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to add one more safety measure. Now, we didn't actually take a look at the data file that ends up getting spit out from your Chronos, so from that analog in 1. We didn't actually take a look at that yet, so we don't know what kind of signals we're going to get. So we don't know for sure if this is going to work. Because if you take a look at my Chronos properties here, for analog in 1, if we take a look at these properties, I'm not entirely sure that my sample rate's set correctly. I'm not entirely sure that history size is going to work out. I don't know that my scaled min and max are going to work out fine, and I don't know if my onset and offset thresholds are set correctly. So I'm not going to know any of that until I see this output file. So I'm not entirely sure that setting up a Chronos input mask and just setting the analog in to 9 is going to work right off the bat right now. So I want to actually take a look at this file once I'm done. So while I'm here also, I'm going to change this collection mode to presses and releases. There we go. All right. So that's why in my stimulus object, since I'm not entirely sure that this is going to work, I'm actually going to add one more input mask, and it's going to be a keyboard, and this will just be my kind of emergency situation. Like, in case I don't get this signal from Chronos and I'm waiting for a very long time, I have a way to move on from this slide, and I have a way to go, okay, like this didn't work, I'm going to keep going. And I'm just going to add my release there. There we go. So now I have my analog input signal, and I have a press, which will be my onset threshold, and my release, which will be my offset threshold. And then I have my keyboard just kind of as that emergency backup. Go ahead and click apply and OK. And then all I'm going to do in my session proc is I'm just going to add a goodbye slide at the very end. And I will just say, thank you very much for your participation. There we go, participation. Cool. So now I have my very simple experiment set up, and what I recommend doing if you're following along at home is just give it a run. If you have an analog input that you want to test out, just give it a whirl. Let's see if the analog or the allowable here, if this pseudo button works. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to save it. It's important to save as frequently as possible in ePrime. I'm just going to keep this one here. I'm actually have a folder on my desktop and analog in here. I'm just going to save this one as analog in live stream. There we go. So I am actually not going to run this. I don't have an analog input hooked up right now, but I do have resulting data files. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what those data files look like. So the first one that you're going to get is going to be recording analog in and then the experiment name. So this is the kind of output that you should expect for this. So what you see here is you see the RT time as ePrime is logging in. Then you see RT time in microseconds in case you need level specificity, the sample that you're getting, and the sequence that you're getting, and then the channel that it was being recorded in, and then the date that it was run and the time that it was run. So as you can see, it was run in the past a bit. So what I'm looking for here specifically is the sample. So what are the signals that I'm getting, and how high are they going? And if you remember, I actually had my range being set from 0 to 1. So 0 was where they were being set before, or 0 is kind of the default, and then I'm getting a signal of 0.01 into this, into here. And I recommend just taking a look at this, seeing like how long until you get, an actual input here. What is the input being logged as? And then if you want to see this in a much nicer way, we actually have this XML file. So as you can see here, it's the exact same data, but there's also this really nice graph up here. And this is what's going to make it really clear about where your onset and offset threshold should be. So as you can see, I'm getting spikes here just before 0.6, and then my lows are getting down to 0 here. So this is where I would set my onset and offset thresholds for this. So I would want a response to end up being 0.5, because as you can see consistently, I'm getting 0.5 as my response here, or as the peak, and perhaps even more. But consistently I'm getting this to 0.5, so this is what I want as my onset threshold, or I would want this to be logged as my press. And then my release would be, somewhere around 0.1 or maybe even 0, because it is getting that low. So this graph does a really good job of showing you exactly the types of signals that you're getting, when they're coming in, and how frequently they're coming in. So this is going to be really valuable for taking a look at all of the properties in Chronos to make sure that those are all set up correctly. So I do recommend doing that. So now that I have this, now that I have all this information and I know exactly what I'm going to be doing, the next thing I want to do is actually set my thresholds based on this information. So I'm actually going to make an inline object, and this inline object is just going to go after my instructions here. There you go. And this one's just going to be called set thresholds. I'm going to show you how to set the thresholds in Chronos and script. So first you need to do Chronos, then get access to the analog in. We're doing Chronos.analog in. This is just script sense for those of you who are new to this. Analog in. Then I need to pick the channel, and in this case I'm sending to channel 1 since I'm still doing some exploratory, hey, I want to make sure that this is working kind of data or kind of runs right now. And then I will do .onset threshold, and then I will set my onset threshold equal to 0.1. So that's how I would set the threshold for that input that I had mentioned earlier. And then now I need to set my offset threshold. So I would just access that in the same way, Chronos.analog in, specify the channel, .offset threshold, and I'll set that one equal to 0.05, as I had mentioned before. And there you go. If you take a look there, then that's going to be exactly in line with what we have. So then I just set my thresholds. So the next thing I want to do, now that I have my threshold set, is I actually want to just, I want to actually prepare Chronos for receiving these kinds of signals. So I'm going to be doing a lot of just setting some of the Chronos properties to 0, just to make sure everything's reset before it collects data, just to make sure that I'm getting the cleanest possible data set. So I'm actually going to take my inline 1 and put it just before my fixation object. And I'm just going to access a few properties. So in get ready, I'll do Chronos .analog in, and I'll do history. I have to specify here we go, specify a channel, and I'll do history, and then I'll do .remove all. So what this is going to do is it's actually going to clear the history for the analog in buffer here. So I know that there isn't any like errant signals coming in before my trial starts. So then just do Chronos .history.remove all. If I do Chronos.history.remove all, it actually just clears the responses in Chronos' history as well. So I'm making sure that the analog input is being cleared, but then I'm also making sure that the history for the Chronos device itself is being cleared as well. And then after that, I'm just going to sleep for 10 seconds. Just to give Chronos enough time to actually clear its history before moving on to other things. And then I'll do Chronos analog in.record. Now I have to actually specify a channel again. There we go. So now Chronos knows that I'm going to be recording through my analog in. So now I just want to set a couple of variables to make sure everything is clear. So I'm going to actually dim a variable called x. It's just going to be a long. So then I just define a few more variables. I'll do that pretty quickly. So dim. There we go. So I now set 3 variables. I have highest value, value float, and value integer. These are going to make sure that things are reset in Chronos once I actually set everything to 0. So give me 1 second, and all I have to do is just do n highest value equals 0. And I'll do n value float equals 0. And I will do n value integer equals 0. And I'm just going to copy and paste these. Oops, there we go. And that's all I need for my inline 1, which I'm actually going to rename just get ready. So now everything is set for Chronos to start recording in analog in 1. I've actually cleared everything, and I've set the highest value float and value integer to 0. These don't actually interact with Chronos yet, but they will later, and I'm just making sure they're being set to 0 now temporarily. So the next thing I'm going to add to it is going to be a little bit longer as far as scripting is concerned. So I actually have its contents in a text file, and I'm going to just copy and paste them into my experiment, and then I'll explain what they're doing. That way I'm not sitting here forever just typing inline script. So this one is going to be called process responses. And I actually have this in my folder here. So if you look here, I have process responses. This is actually from our process responses template. But it's just modified to include some Chronos features. So I'm just going to walk through what this is all doing here. So first I'm sending something called the response object. That's going to be a variable that I'm going to use later, and the response object is being set to my stimulus object. So I'm looking specifically at my stimulus object. I have a debug assert statement. For those of you who are familiar with script, the debug assert statement is actually going to end the experiment if this object here is nothing. So if I don't have an object named stimulus, it's actually going to stop my experiment and say, hey, you don't have an object named stimulus. This script isn't going to be able to work correctly. And then the next bit of it is actually just pretty standard for ePrime. What this is doing is it's taking multiple responses that are going to be made to stimulus, and it's going to log them as separate values in your EDAT file. And it's just going to be key press, the value of the key press, and then it's going to log its RT and response value. For those of you who are interested in multiple responses, we have an excellent sample on this as well. This is honestly just lifted straight from the example. Now the part that is the most interesting, though, especially for this webinar, is what happens after this for next loop. The Chronos.analog in 1.stop. So if you notice and get ready, I actually started recording the analog in right here. So my Chronos analog in 1.record, and then in my process responses, this is where I stop my recording of the analog in 1. So for my history count, or I just have a little debug print statement underneath here, and it says the history count is, and then it's just telling me how many samples I got through the analog in one channel through Chronos. So that's actually going to show up in this debug window in my output pane down here. So now what it does is I'm actually going to find the highest value, the value float, and the value integer. So what I'm doing now with this for next loop is I'm actually just enumerating through each one of the signals I got from Chronos, and then I'm just saying if highest value, value float, and value integer are all less than what I get here, then I'm going to set my value float, and my value integer to the highest value that I'm getting. And that's just, like I said, just enumerating through every single object in the history, and I'm going to set it to the value float, value integer, and value. I'm going to set to the highest possible value that I get. And then at the very end, I'm just setting 3 attributes called max press value, max value float, and max value integer. Those are going to represent the maximum possible signal that I got from the analog input. And those are just going to be logged in my EDAT file through the c.setAttrib statement. So now if I were to run my experiment, not only would I check out this text file that I got at the end of running the experiment, just to make, or not that text file, this text file that I got from running the experiment, just to make sure that my signals came in. But now I would also check my max press value, my max value float, my max integer to see how E prime is logging the very, very uppermost value that I'm getting from my analog input. And then once I have that all set up, that's when I would start moving on to analog 2 and analog 3. So up until this point, we've been mostly focusing on just very simple responses. So we've been focusing on, am I getting a signal, what's the maximum value of the signal, and then I'm using that signal literally just to advance from this stimulus object. This isn't demonstrating a broad range of communication types or communication, it's just basically triggering, or basically treating it like a button. So am I getting a signal? Yes. Did the signal stop? Yes. There's my press, there's my release, done. The other option that we have is to treat it more like a slider, so I can get a range of options and a range of signals from my analog input as well. So I'll no longer be treating it like just like an on-off switch. So there's off, there's on, this triggers it on, this triggers it off. What if I want to get at all of these little intermediary kind of signals that are happening in between, and want to do something a little more dynamic with it? Like a slider, like moving a slider like that, the slider that we saw that I mentioned earlier. To do that, it's going to be a little different, but no less difficult. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to, in my block list, I'm going to add one more procedure. Instead of block proc, I'm going to call it slider block proc. I'm going to hit enter. And then in slider block proc, I'm actually just going to add a text display object. This doesn't need multiple trials. This is just kind of one thing. So I'm just going to add a text display object here, and this is going to be called value display. So the purpose of this text display object is actually just going to show a value that's being read back from the analog input along the slider. So since it's going to be doing that, and it needs to be updated dynamically, whatever's on this doesn't actually matter, because it's going to be updated using inline script that I'm going to add later. So for now, I'm actually just going to type the word hello, because honestly what's going to be here doesn't matter at all. So then I'm going to go back into my slider block proc here. I'm going to take an inline, and I'm going to drag it and drop it just after value display. And I'm going to call this one start loop. There we go. And then I am just going to start typing some script, and I'll explain it as I type. So the first thing I'm going to do is just make a constant. So I just have a constant. It's called AD channel. So this is my analog in channel. I'm defining it as along, and it's going to equal 1. Because what this is going to do is it's going to tell me what analog in channel I'm using. And I'm setting it as a constant at the top of the inline object instead of always putting analog 1, analog 1, analog 1. Because I don't ultimately want to be using analog 1 because it's going to have more noise. I'm just using it for testing now. I want to be using 2 or 3. So instead of having to change that in 8 different places in the script, I just keep referencing this constant, and I can just swap out the channel that I'm using by changing the number right here. And it's going to make it much more dynamic and much easier to port to other experiments if I do it this way. So the next thing I want to do is I want to make a do loop. Like I had mentioned before, it's going to be a loop that's going to update this value, and it's going to be constantly reading in from the analog input. Now I'll just put my loop here. Oops. There we go. Just so I have my structure of my do loop. There we go. So now I have my do loop. Next thing I'm going to do is change the value display text. There we go. Okay, text. And I'm going to set that equal to scaled. And then a little ampersand. This is just known as concatenation. I'm going to be kind of tacking on the next bit of script onto the word scaled. And then this is going to be a little long. So Chronos, analog in, whoops. And then instead of writing 1, this is where I do my AD channel. Get current sample value. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to get the value of the current sample in the history. So it's going to be constantly reading from the analog input. That's what this call does. And that's just going to be blank there. And then I'm going to do something called EBTab. EBTab is an eBasic constant, and tab just means it's actually going to tab over one. So what I'm doing is I'm actually creating a single tab in the text display here. So it's going to be scaled, and then it's going to get the current sample value. It's going to tab itself over one, and then I'm going to output the raw portion of the data. So if I do this, sorry, I just like setting up the structure of strings first. So I'll set that up, and it'll say raw. And Chronos dot, and then that analog in again. We're going to reference the same channel again. Get current sample value, and I'm going to set this one to 2. And that's going to verify that I get the raw data from that. And then I do an ampersand, and then I just close off that quotation mark there. And then I just do value display dot draw. So now, once I do this, this hello text that I have on the screen here is actually going to disappear, and it's going to be replaced with my scaled and raw version of the data that I'm reading in from the current sample value of my Chronos analog in. So then I'll just do a quick if-then statement. Display input masks 1 is pending, then exit do, and end if. So what this is doing is this is just getting me out of this. So what the first part of the script will be doing is just constantly reading from the Chronos analog in on whatever channel I specify, and it's just printing the values that I'm getting, and it's drawing those values to the screen. Well, now what I'm doing here is I'm just saying, okay, if my conditional exit state, it doesn't equal 0, so if I'm going to be exiting out of the experiment early, or if my input mask for value display 1, which I still need to set, has been pressed, then I'm going to exit this do loop. So I'm just going to add that input mask to my value display very quickly. I'll change this to 0. And I will add a keyboard input mask. And what I'm going to do actually is I'm going to set the time limit here. I'm going to change it from same as duration because it'll terminate the second it gets off of this. I'm going to change it from same as duration just until end of proc. So that way it's still active during this loop here. And I'm going to set this to spacebar. There we go. And I'll set data logging here to standard just so I log as much data as possible. And there we go. So what this is going to effectively do is it's actually going to show us the range of values that we're going to be getting from our analog in. You can then use that to scale it in your experiment to kind of make a slider or interact with a slider. So I know that I'm going to be getting this value at this time when the slider that I have has moved to this position. And then I move the slider to this position and it'll be sending me this value. You can then use that to inform your slider movement on your actual experiment itself. So that's going to be the best way to kind of access all of that information in ePrime. And that's just how to access more, like a broader range of information from your analog in scale than my first sample, which was literally just, am I getting data? Yes. Am I getting from this range to this range? Yes or no? And I'm going to move on. So this is going to actually be a more nuanced approach to it. So that is actually all the content I have for today. This is just a brief overview of how to handle analog in. If anybody has any questions at all, please feel free to either submit a support ticket to support.pstunet.com. We're always happy to elaborate there. If you have any ideas for future webinars, please feel free to send us those as well. I'd be more than happy to tailor these to what you guys need. Otherwise, feel free to like and subscribe on the video. Thank you guys very much for attending today. I hope you have a great day.